7, Towser Lecturer Scott Fuller.
I give up. It's amazing what your family and friends can do when they collude, isn't it? Beware. Okay, let me just begin with a number of thank yous. The presentation this morning was the result of a collaborative effort. Mary being one of the collaborators, and Will Beatty. My friend the Warrenders helped with this project. And then a special thanks to Kathleen Kramer, who has accompanied me on this journey. And a journey it has been. In fact, it began in Mary's living room in 2003 in Florence when Mary was teaching in the study abroad program, and I was over there researching Leonardo da Vinci. And Sean Forrester, Phil's son, was there. He lives in Florence and was studying art. And Will was there, and we ended up very spontaneously having a discussion about art and aesthetics and what made great art and what was that all about. And though I had been interested in art my entire life, these questions came with a freshness that I had never experienced. It was like being in grad school and having your eyes opened for the first time. And then the quest, the journey continued last semester when I was teaching in Paris. And hey, Russ, I'm going to start now, I think. And I had the opportunity to visit the Dordogne in the southwestern part of France. And the Dordogne is famous for its caves and its cave art. So I was able to visit the caves at Rouffignac and Font de Gaume and Camberwell. But most important for me was the cave of Lascaux. And though the actual cave is no longer accessible, there's been a tremendous amount of damage, much of it from people visiting from the CO2. They've created a remarkable facsimile, Lascaux 2, Lascaux Faux, the artificial cave, but it has the same effect. And as I looked at this art, I was increasingly amazed, not only at the skill, but I was amazed at my emotional response. I had this palpable, tangible feeling of another human mind that I could recognize, reaching across time. I didn't know what the message was, although I felt there was some message there. And this overwhelming sense of, oh my God, what amazing creatures we are. Lascaux was occupied roughly from 19,000 years ago to about 15,000 years ago. And yet there was an aliveness and there was a freshness in these paintings. And I started asking those questions, again, that had occurred in Mary's living room about what is art really about? Why do we do it? Where did it come from? Why do you find it in almost all human cultures? And so I developed a thesis, and that is that basically about 50,000 years ago, there was an explosion in human mental abilities. Sometimes it's called the creative explosion. Sometimes it's called the mind's Big Bang. And that in that process of 50,000 years ago, plus or minus 20,000 years, that's one of the things I had to get used to in all this was working with paleoarchaeological time. 20,000 years plus or minus, it's not a big deal. For some people it is, but not apparently for paleoarchaeologists. Anyway, I became fascinated with these questions of why art, where does it come from, why is it a human universal? So what I want to do this morning is quickly take you through looking at art as a universal, what that means, what sense we can make out of that. Then I want to share with you the approach I use to looking at art, which is an interdisciplinary approach. So I want to talk a little bit about the disciplines that I've pulled in to do this exploration. And then take you into the thesis itself about the mind's Big Bang and the biological foundations for art. And then I want to talk about how that translates into society, how what perhaps starts out biologically very quickly becomes social. And then I want to end with talking about how art transcends its own social and biological origins. So it's quite a full plate, and I'm going to have to move at a pretty quick clip. But I'm going to try to put most of this on my website, my school website, and certainly a bibliography for you. So if I end up moving too fast, you can look stuff up, and then hopefully we can have emails with each other and talk about some of this, okay? So let's start by looking at art as a human universal. One of the amazing things to me is that across time, across space, across human cultures, you find some version of art. This is a rock painting that's roughly 45,000 years old, roughly about the same time as the cave paintings in Europe, perhaps a little earlier. And it's from Australia. A Caravaggio that's in the Louvre. African carved art. Islamic art that can't use figurative representation. The sand paintings of the Southwest. The art of ancient Egypt. Buddhist iconography. The masks of the Pacific Northwest. Medieval Western art. The Chola bronze, the Nataraja of the 12th century India. And the courtly art of the ancient Maya. Hopefully many of you saw that when it was here not too long ago. In the West, we tend to look at art for art's sake, meaning that we're compelled to make art, and that art has its own justification. But one of the first things you face when you look at art in a universal fashion is that in many cultures, there's no notion of art as we understand it. For example, in the Mende of Africa, a Mende sculptor was being interviewed by an anthropologist. And the sculptor was saying, I'm not nearly the sculptor that my father was. And the anthropologist asked him why. And he says, well, I sculpt for other people. I make things for other people. My father, he made things for the gods. Or among the Inuit of the Arctic Circle, the Inuit have no word for art. They have no word for artist. In fact, for the Inuit, everyone knows how to carve. It's an everyday thing. And again, in a discussion with an anthropologist, an Inuit carver was asked, well, why then do you do these carvings? And he said simply, well, there's a proper way to do everything. So our glorified conceptions of art are not contained in many of the cultures of the world. But you and I, in fact, would recognize this as art. It may not be recognized by others as art. And we'll come back to the sticky problem that creates. Art is also a contested concept in this culture, what philosophers call a contested concept, which is, guess what? Nobody can agree upon what it is. If you want to get a good example of that, in 1997, the Royal Academy in London put on an exhibition called the Sensation Exhibition, where they took art from the Saatchi collection and of young artists. And people resigned from the board of the Royal Academy. For example, in this famous piece by Damien Hirst, what he did was he took a cow's head, let it deteriorate, flooded the thing with maggots and flies, and called it 1,000 years. Or in this piece by the Chapman brothers, based on a Goya etching, dismembered bodies in an unbelievably realistic plastic form. Or this piece, good, you're paying attention, that's a good sign. Or this piece by Sarah Lewis, I don't need to have to describe it, but one wonders the art school that she ended up attending. So anyway, you can see, is that art? Well, it's not for me to say whether it is or not. It's just very interesting that what you find is a tremendously wide variation. And maybe this rather modern piece that looks kind of like an early Jackson Pollock was created by a chimpanzee named Congo in the 1950s. That's his trainer, the ethologist Desmond Morris. 3 months ago, that piece sold for 24,000 pounds in London. So, I'm not going to even try to define art in any formal sense. It would just make me look silly and ridiculous. But I want to turn to philosopher William James, who suggested that concepts have what he called a kernel meaning. Even a contested concept, like art, has a kernel meaning. And then branching out from that are all kinds of fringe meanings that are heavily contextual, that are historical, that are interactional. And so we use terms like, oh, medicine's not a science, it's an art. Or we say the art of loving. And somehow that makes sense to us. Perhaps even a more fruitful path would be to look at Wittgenstein's idea of family resemblances. But what I'm interested in is this idea that there's a kernel meaning that perhaps we can begin to use to talk about art across time and space. And so for me, even though I recognize there's a tremendous amount of relativity in art, a tremendous amount of relativity in standards of aesthetics, there still seems to be a human universal to transform the material culture in ways that involve an aesthetic creation of objects and images that are both interesting and underline interesting and also have symbolic meaning. So that's the definition of art that I'm going to be using, a kind of a rough and ready definition. And that's what I think you find in all human cultures. Now, to begin to explore this, I had to draw on a huge, not a huge, but for me a huge number of disciplines. And the starting place for me is with the fact that we as human beings are biological creatures. We have an evolutionary history. And that certainly with things that are human universals, we have to talk about biology. But we are also psychological creatures that have unique individual histories and unique forms of creativity. And that's in many ways perhaps even more important than our biology. And that we're also social creatures who grow up in a specific time and place in history and have specific social locations. And then finally, we're spiritual creatures. We have unique relationships to the unseen world. For some, it's about God. Who knows what it's about? But we have that special relationship. And the world of art lives in all these worlds. Okay? Transcends, if you like, all these worlds and affects all these worlds. So I'm starting with a recognition that I'm going to have to cross these different worlds or spheres that we live in as human beings. In terms of discipline, my starting place is with what is called evolutionary psychology. Because I'm assuming that art is a human universal, there should be some kind of evolutionary origins, some kind of adaptation that helped human beings survive. Now, that's not going to be true of all human behavior, but I think when you get into universals, that in fact makes some sense. Current evolutionary psychologists basically look at the human mind like a Swiss Army knife, that we developed a set of modules that were specific adaptations to environmental pressures over time. And so we have, if you like, all these different abilities put together in this one package that we call the mind. And so I kept asking myself, well, what would art be selected for? How could that, improve our survivability? And I kept going, well, maybe evolutionary psychology is not going to be of much help here. And then I was reminded by Stephen Jay Gould's critique of evolutionary psychology, where Gould says in his famous article with Richard Lewontin, Spandrels of St. Mark's in Venice, that, you know what? Not everything that human beings do, in fact, not everything that living creatures do, is selected for, okay? Some of it is just by accident. You have alleles, and they're attached to, functions that get selected for, and they come along for the ride. So I started thinking, well, was art something that just came along for the ride? And I kept going, no. Universals are not just things that go along for the ride. Maybe. He also developed a term called acceptation, where he said oftentimes what happens in evolution is that you borrow things. For example, long before there were birds, there were dinosaurs that had feathers. And birds basically accepted feathers. And that much of evolution can be seen as things developing in one context and then being borrowed in another context. So I'm going, well, maybe that's the case with art. So these are the things that are buzzing through my head, okay? The example he uses in terms of the spandrels of San Marcos is that, look at the dome. And you've got a dome that's supported by 4 arches. And where those arches come together supporting the dome, there are these triangular structures called spandrels. If you have a dome and you have arches, guess what? You naturally get spandrels. That's how it works. Were they created by the architect for any particular reason? No. They just were an artifact. So is art a spandrel? Okay. To paleoanthropology, I turn for examples, for the fossil record, for the record of tool industry and artifact. Okay, so that's where I started looking for evidence for things on this quest. For the interactions with the brain, I turned to cognitive and affective neuroscience. The 1990s were literally the age of the brain because of brain scans, and so there's been a quantum leap in terms of what we know about brain and brain function, and so I'm going to look at how that, in fact, in some ways affects art. And then from my own discipline, sociology, the role that art plays in society. And then from art history, I'm looking for universals, things that we can see perhaps across time and space in the world of art. And so what I'm trying to find is this center place where these disciplines come together. And you'll see as I go through this that I'm constantly looking for where the psychology of evolutionary history, anthropology, sociology, art history, neuroscience all connect up. Okay, now to the mind's Big Bang. And what happened? I have a stick. Oops. So I'm going to have to do some old-fashioned teaching here. I was ruminating the other day. When I first started teaching, it was chalk and talk. That was it. And that was great. Can't do that anymore. The world has changed on us. But this is a reminiscence of the chalk and talk days. Basically, in terms of the evolution of the size of the human brain, okay, this is starting about 4 million years ago. There is a tremendous amount of constancy in size. And about 2 million years ago, you get a big jump. And then another million years ago, you get another jump. Now, if we plot tool making on this, what you begin to see is that tools come about at a time when there's no jump in brain size. So you go, well, gee, what is the relationship between the size of the brain and tool making, all right? Then we get a second jump where there's a jump in the size of the human brain, but tools don't change, and they remain relatively static for about 1.5 million years. And then finally, the period that we're going to be interested in, which is about 50,000 years ago, there's this huge jump, but it's not till the end of this jump that we get the creative explosion, the development of art, and a tremendous array of human artifact. There's about a 150,000-year period between the development of what would be recognizably anatomically modern humans, meaning this person would walk down the street and you would go, you know, you're kind of ugly, but you look like me. And the rise of what paleoanthropologists call behaviorally modern humans. So there's about a 150-year period. And generally, it's the advent of imagery, of figurative art, and pushing the dates back a little, perhaps to about 70,000, 80,000 years ago, the development of beads where human beings are engaged in adornment and putting incised patterns on things. This is, in the literature, considered perhaps to be the oldest sign, surviving sign of humans using some kind of symbolic form. No idea what it is, but there's nothing like it before. And this is a piece of red ochre that was used for decoration. Similarly with the beads, it goes back, 75 to 80,000 years ago. So there are antecedents, and also in human burials. This burial is much more recent. This is about a 30,000-year-old burial. But even though there are antecedents, when one actually starts to look at the artifacts, at the archaeological record, you are amazed at this explosion. I visited the National Prehistoric Museum in Les Aisies in the Dordogne, and they have these cases of artifacts. And you'll be walking along, and you'll be looking at the tools, and they kind of all look alike, and you realize you're walking down millions of years. And then all of a sudden, and the tools look like this, the kind of the Acheulean hand axes. They were the kind of the tool you would use for everything. And then all of a sudden, you began to see not only bone being used, and this is roughly 50,000 years ago, you began to see bone being used, but these remarkably, gorgeously crafted, specific tools that were fine and delicate and an array beyond imagination. And you really begin to feel this explosion that came about. And not only did it come about in Northern Europe, you find very similar artifacts in South Africa and in Australia. Most of us think that when we left Africa, roughly 50,000 years ago, plus or minus 20, that all the pieces for behaviorally modern humans were in place. And that's why you find it kind of simultaneously in both Africa and in Australia. But that's a whole nother lecture, and it's full of all kinds of debate. Now, the question for me then was, well, what's that creative explosion about? Why did it occur? And what were the essential elements in it? Basically, we became behaviorally modern, okay, during a period of tremendous climate change. And in fact, there perhaps has never been a period that had quite as profound fluctuations in climate as this period, basically the last ice age. And so the human beings were presented with tremendous environmental pressures. Now, the consensus of people who are looking at the evolution of the brain is that the climate change obviously did not produce brain changes, but what it did produce was tremendous selective pressure. That is to say, because of constantly having to adapt to new environments, human beings had to become very creative. Creativity was selected for. So what I want to look at now are the building blocks that this pumping effect of climate change worked on. What were the pieces that we're basically being selected for, and particularly the pieces that we're being selected for that would turn into art. The first is humans' ability to mimic. Now, you find mimicry in birds, you find mimicry in the primates, but complex sequential mimicry, being able to imitate long strings of things in great complexity, is unique to us. And it turns out that we're actually wired for that. For those of you who kind of read the science stuff, you'll know that in the last 10 years, one of the big revolutions in brain science has been the discovery of mirror neurons. So that when I look at you, for example, eating an ice cream bar, not only is my visual cortex and my memory centers triggered, but the very parts of my face and body that would be eating an ice cream bar myself are also being triggered. We are wired to imitate not only others, but we are wired to imitate the world itself. That gives us empathy. So when I look at Degas' Absinthe Drinker, not only do I rely on my memories of absinthe, that's one of the things you can do in France, but what that felt like and what that facial expression feels like. I'm wired for that. It's not a hard thing for me to do. Now, for art, I think the first building block has to do with play. That is to say, where we act out, where we try out, where we explore those things that we've seen is in the world of play. And most artists will tell you that when they do art, it feels like play. It has that quality of innovation, of freshness, of exploration that is associated with what play felt like when we were children. The second building block for art is our ability to engage in representation. And again, you can see how closely that is tied to our mimetic abilities, that we can see and that we can translate that and we can represent that. And I think that was highly selected for. It allowed us to draw pictures of things, to talk about hunting, to have maps of territory. There were massive selective advantages for the ability to represent. Now, the next group are basically things that neuropsychologists talk about as blendings, where different domains or different areas in the mind come together, blend together to create very, very unique neural networks. And for me, the third building block of art is the basically linking together of feeling, emotion, with pattern recognition. Now, I'm going to challenge you guys a little bit. Take a look at this painting. It is by Salvador Dali. It is known as The Slave Market or the Bust of Voltaire. Now, because of the lighting, I can't see you very well. But do you all see the bust of Voltaire? Well, in fact, let me see. Anybody not see the bust of Voltaire? You'll never raise your hands in a group this size because you'll go, what? What? I don't see it, but nobody's got their hands up. Okay? Well, keep taking a look there and see if you see this this fellow that looks like Voltaire, the French philosopher. Kind of looks like George Washington, okay? Now, if you don't see it, all right, look there. Okay, look there. See it? Yeah? Generally, when people see it, what you're going to get are these little, or you know, these little bursts, all right? And still, for those of you that don't see it, there it is. Okay. Okay? Now, let's do one that's a little more difficult. Okay? Be brave. Somebody tell me, what's that a picture of? A what? Oh, okay. Dalmatian dog. Now, for those of you that don't see that, there's a Dalmatian dog in that picture. Okay, keep looking. Keep looking. Keep looking. How about now? Oh! Now, the most important thing in all this is that oh! Okay? Not that you see the dog or not, is that oh. Dalmatian dog. Sniffing the ground, all of that. Now, what all this is about is the fact that pattern recognition, seeing things, has an emotional attachment to it. That is, it feels good. In preparing for this the other day, I went back to the MoMA, to the Museum of Modern Art, and took another look at the Anselm Kiefer exhibit. And I found that as I was looking at his paintings, very abstract paintings, I would keep seeing different patterns. And I was watching my body, and it felt really good. Every time I say, oh, and they were tiny and they were little, but it was unbelievably satisfying. Well, the argument I'm making is this becomes essential for human survival. We develop these complex neural pathways between the visual cortex, between the pattern recognition centers of the brain, and between feelings. And why was that important? Because in this period I'm talking about, we were walking around the African savannas. And you know what? There were predators. And our ability to pick out predators and also to pick out food sources meant we either would survive or not. And so, boom, okay? There was a tremendous survival benefit to attaching emotions to pattern recognition. Fourth building block. The integration of hand, eye, thought, and imagination. In fact, figurative art, as we understand it today, would be virtually impossible. If I could not go from my eye to my hand, if I could not go from my imagination to my hand, I couldn't create art. And all the things that we know about art simply would be non-existent. Now, what's the evolutionary origin of that? Again, it goes back to hunting, I think. That when human beings are basically throwing, whether you're throwing a football or you're throwing a spear or a rock, once you start throwing, you can't stop. It's a very, very quick process of preparing and releasing. And so what you have to do is you have to plan ahead. And so, if I'm throwing a rock at a rabbit and, I release it just a little bit too early, it goes too far. And if I release it just a little bit too late, it falls short. So what I have to be able to do is I have to be able to plan that action based on, in most cases, an awful lot of practice. Each time I'm in that situation, it is a new situation. And so what I'm bringing together is basically the ability to plan movement on one side and blending that with the ability to think about and imagine on the other to produce a unique blending in the human mind. And that's what I think most of brain evolution starts to look like, are these overlapping blendings of modules, now we're going back to evolutionary psychology, of these modules for one area blending together with modules for another area to produce an entirely new set of skills and capabilities. Fifth building block for art. It wasn't simple. Synesthesia. Classically, synesthesia, and most of us have this ability to a minor degree. Artists apparently have it to a much greater degree, 7 times more prevalent in artists than everyday folks, okay? Synesthesia is the ability to take information from one modality and translate it into another modality. So, for example, I listen to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and I see, literally, see red. Or, again, using the example from the MoMA the other day, I'm looking at this vision of a desolate, snowy, bleak environment in Anselm Kiefer's painting, and I'm physically feeling cold. Most artists will tell you that they rely very heavily on synesthesia in terms of working with their art. Now, just a quick example for you. Look at those two figures, the blue figure and the green figure. Now, I'm going to show you a word, and I want you to apply that word to one of these figures. Which one do you want to apply it to? Green? You sure? Okay. And this word? The blue. Okay? Now, what you're doing is you're blending sound, kiki, boba, with figure. Now, what's interesting is across human cultures, 95 to 98% of respondents, even though they have remarkably different languages, some that don't even have sounds like kiki or boba, are able to make that blend. So again, it appears that we have a wiring for synesthesia. We even know the part of the brain, this kind of stuff goes on in something called the angular gyrus. And if people have lesions in that part of the brain, they can't do synesthesia. They can't do the blending. They see no relationship, say, between sounds on one side and images on the other. Now, even though I'm talking very specifically about figurative art, visual art, painting, sculpture, this in part becomes the basis for metaphor, for poetics, certainly becomes part of the basis for music and rhythm. You can go on and on and on. So I think many of the things I'm talking about can be translated into the other arts, though I have a much more limited location. Sixth building block for art is the propensity for exaggeration. Okay, now this gets very, very specific, and I think for a lot of you, it's going to kind of be an interesting, unusual way to think about art. Much of the work I'm relying on here is actually the work of V.S. Ramachandran, who's at UC San Diego. And Ramachandran was one of the first neurobiologists to become seriously interested in what were the biological foundations underlying art. And one of the things that he said is that there's this phenomena called peak shift that you find up and down the phylogenetic scale. And probably the most famous example of the use of peak shift was the work done on herring gulls. And basically, what herring gulls have is they have a red spot on their beaks. And what the little chicks will do is they will pick at that red spot. And at some point then the mother opens up and lets the little chick, she regurgitates food up and lets the little chicks eat that, okay? Now, what ethologists, people studying animal behavior, discovered was that you could actually present chicks with something other than the mother's beak and they would peck at it. But most interesting is that you could present them with a stick that had a bunch of spots on it and they would peck at it even more than something that looked realistically like the mother's beak. And that's called the peak shift effect. Now, the argument that Ramachandran makes is that you find this in human art. We are not that interested in things that just look like what we see. That what we're interested in is things that exaggerate those things that are important to us. So from the very beginnings of human art, we find exaggeration. The other day, again, preparing for this, I walked through the Asian Art Museum. And I made a bet with my friend. I said, see if you can find one piece of art that is purely representational. Couldn't find one. All of them involve some form of exaggeration based on aesthetics, based on importance, based on formal styles. The Venus of Willendorf, about 25,000 years old, have no idea what those exaggerations mean. There's a huge literature on it. Everybody's guessing. But it's no accident that those features were exaggerated. Are, again, from a very similar period, the Losange, again, an exaggeration in the form. More contemporary, this is in the Medici tomb in Florence. It's by Michelangelo. We could make a lot of jokes about whether Michelangelo really knew about women, but you look at the structure and you go, there are very conscious exaggerations that you'll see in all of Michelangelo's work. Are in the Chola bronze, Parvati, exaggeration. Are in Ange's famous picture of the woman in the harem, the elongation of the back. If you saw another human being that looked like that, you would have her go to the chiropractor really quickly. Okay? Now, it's not that Ange couldn't do it. It's that what he found interesting was this elongation. Or in Henry Moore's sculpture, even in Leonardo, we look at the Mona Lisa and but the Mona Lisa's got a funny face. And you see that in all of Leonardo's paintings. Okay? What you see is that he was using idealized facial proportions that were very important and very pleasing to him, but very different than the facial proportions that we use today. Or in Buddhist art, again, a formulary for proportion. Okay? Now, we're almost there. Seventh building block for art. Syntax in language and art. the ability to make the order of events important is critical, not only in language usage, but in the structure of how we understand the world. Without even changing the words in the sentence, just the word order, we get dramatically different meaning. The dog bit the man. The man bit the dog. Same elements, simply different word order. Well, there's the equivalence of that also in art. It's a very famous illusion in psychology called the Liar-Mueller illusion. Hopefully most of you have seen it. But the language goes like something like this. Look at the figure on the right. Look at the figure on the left. Now look at the center line. Does one line appear to be longer than the other? And the answer is yes. Which one? The one on the left. Are they exactly the same? Yes, they are. Okay? It's syntax. Exactly the same elements arranged in a different order give us an entirely different meaning. Now, I know, can you guys see that? I couldn't actually get in and mess with it. But if you look at that red dot in the middle, many of you will get is actually apparent motion. There's really nothing moving up there other than the end pieces, but by switching their relationship, you can even create the illusion of movement itself. And now finally, our last building block for art, complex symbolism. And I think many of us consider perhaps this the most important. Again, it goes hand in hand with the development of language and language systems. This is a Venus sculpture about 22,000 years ago. And again, its structure is a good representation of the peak shift effect. But this from the same period is very interesting because now what is being blended, what is being mixed together is the masculine and the feminine. And that's the masculine, by the way, for those of you that have the imagination for that. But what you find is that there's a whole array of these throughout the Dordogne of roughly about the same period. Some more phallic, less feminine, some more feminine, less phallic. But again, that blending of very, very complex ideas of masculine and feminine, male and female. Or this about 35,000 years ago, the blending of the lion and the human body form. So what we have then is basically now a coming together of the ability to engage in representation, the propensity for exaggeration, synesthesia, the integration of eye, hand, and thought, play, attaching pattern recognition to emotion, syntax, and complex symbolism. You put them all together and you get art. Now, still a big problem. This is what I came up with. Remember, this is a personal journey. I'm not just, reading whatever the popular theories are. This is what I came up with. And I looked at it, and I looked at it, and I said, no, there's more to art than that. This is what Steve Pinker, who's one of the leading evolutionary psychologists, says about art. He says, look it, art is simply cheesecake for the mind. All those other things were selected for. In each case, I could talk about why they increased our adaptability to the environment. Each one of them. And so Pinker says, look it, when they come together, you've got this adaptation, and boom, out pops art. And I kept thinking, no, that's not what it feels. And this is where you go on your hunches. No, it doesn't feel like that when I look at art. And the chances of a human universal simply being this happenstance of blending is something that I'm just not, at this point, willing to accept. No, I'm still in process. So, finally, I turned to my own discipline. Thank God. This is what happens. You work outside your discipline. I turned to sociology. And there is a wonderful, for those of you that are interested in this as a subject, there's this wonderful woman, Ellen Dissanayake, who really pioneered the evolutionary study of art. And perhaps her most useful book for this is Homo aestheticus. And basically she said, look it, okay, art evolved for a very specific reason, which was to make things special. In all its forms, when we use art, we use it to make things special. Whether it's an adornment of the body or the buttocks, whether it's adorning a spear thrower, 25,000 years old, or making beads that may show our social status, or even a piece of sacred red ochre. It's to set things apart, to make them special in all the different ways and reasons that we make things special. Now, again, this still doesn't take us into adaptation and natural selection, but this is the door. And basically, what the evolutionary psychologists constantly ignore, that no anthropologist or sociologist would ignore, is that by the time you get to Homo sapiens, and way before in all probability, the major adaptive mechanism for human beings was culture. And what other animals had to do physically, we did with culture. And so those things that would increase our cultural adaptabilities were probably selected for. Now, the biology of this is really scary, and the arguments, we're not going to even think about those. But the point, at least for this morning, I'm going to take is that it was what art did in human culture that is critical for our survival. And the key for me is in one of the three founding fathers of sociology, in the work of Emile Durkheim and the elementary forms of religious life. And Durkheim argued that it was ritual that held human beings together. That coming together and recreating our beliefs, our meanings, and sharing, and this is the important part, sharing emotion around those things is what holds us together, is what creates what Durkheim called social solidarity. And that the uses of this making special, the uses of art, were probably first contained in ritual. And I'll give you some interesting evidence for that. But in ritual, it was this ability to make things now sacred that helped provide social cohesion for us at a time when being closely tied together in dramatically changing and harsh circumstances had a huge evolutionary payoff. The vestiges today, the world's religions and their sacred objects, in each case, making something special. And a reminder that in most of human history, not all, but most of what we would call art is attached to what? It's attached to religion. And I think there's no accident there. In fact, people have argued that art and religion emerge roughly simultaneously. So now I want to end by returning to the caves and my quest for why was I so deeply affected. In a thesis developed by Jean Claude, who's perhaps the reigning or one of the reigning French archaeologists, and a South African, David Lewis Williams, and again studying the paintings of the caves, they came to a almost revolutionary conclusion. They came to the conclusion that the art in the caves was not about hunting, not about planning the hunt, because in fact what the folks using the caves were eating were reindeer, and you almost never see reindeer on the walls. What you see are animals that in their world would be big and powerful and important. And so they came to the conclusion that much of what you see in the caves in the south of France or in Spain are really places where shamans went to have their visions and then come back and share those visions with their people. Now, how David Lewis Williams got onto this, and again, if you want to read about his work, he's written a brilliant book, came out a couple years ago, called The Mind in the Cave. How he got onto this was in studying the rock art in South Africa. Now, we don't know the dates of that, but imagine that it's several hundred years old, not like the Paleolithic art in Europe. And the art was located in the Drakensberg Mountains of South Africa, Natal, and it was created by the Sand People. And the Sand People were the indigenous people of South Africa, who were then slowly pushed, or not so slowly pushed in some cases, out of their region and finally located in a very, very small area of South Africa, the Kalahari Desert. Most of us know the San as the Bushman. That's considered a derogatory term. By the way, so is San, but that's the term everybody's using. And that what David Lewis Williams was able to do was that he was able to find anthropological records from the 19th century where this couple, a brother and sister, interviewed the San who had at one time lived in the Drakensberg Mountains and who understood and knew about the paintings, about the rock paintings. And so he was able to piece together what they said about the rock paintings with the contemporary San people who live in the Kalahari. They still today are a shamanistic people. And shamanism, trying to talk about that in 2 minutes. Shamanism is basically this idea that there is another world, an invisible world, a world of spirit, that with special practices that human beings can move into. And that this other world, this separate world, in understanding it, can have effects on human life. So, for example, the San engage in healing practices. The shaman will go into a trance and engage in a healing ceremony. They will do divinations of the future. And it's a very, very important part of their life, their ritual, what holds them together, what gives them, in fact, solidarity in some of the most hellacious conditions that indigenous people have been exposed to. So what David Lewis Williams started to then think about was he said, okay, we have contemporary shamanistic practices, we have the historical practices, can we link them together? Well, for the contemporary San, the most powerful animal for them, the representation, in fact, of their god, is the eland. And the animal that you see most commonly portrayed in sand rock art is the eland. And so he began then looking at the images. And what he discovered was that, in fact, there was a pairing between human form and animal form. The eland has its legs crossed. We're not going to go into interpretations here, but just to notice, the eland has its legs crossed. The shaman has his legs crossed. The eland's hair is standing on end. The shaman's hair is standing on end. The eland's head is depicted, is referenced in the head of the shaman. So there's a story there. And that story is about a journey. So what David Lewis Williams came up with was that basically, because you see all kinds of geometric art on the cave walls, that there was a three-stage process that shaman went through. And the first was basically coming from either hallucinogens or sensory deprivation or a combination of both. These very, very vivid visual patterns that could be reproduced, by the way, in a laboratory. These patterns then were interpreted, and for the San people, most of the interpretations had to do with what they would see as swarms of bees. They would then go through a dramatic transformation, oftentimes talked about as entering the vortex, and then finally having their profound spiritual experience, more often than not having to do with a blending with one of the powerful totemic animals in their world. Now, in looking at the rock art in France, along with Jean-Claude, he found a similar pattern. This, by the way, in the cave of Lascaux is the only depiction of a human being. It's in what's called the shaft. The painters would have had to have climbed up ropes to get to it. It's very, very inaccessible. And again, not knowing exactly how to interpret this, you have a spear thrower, you have a totemic object, you have an animal head on the person, you have an animal that's dying, that's been gutted, and again, there are endless stories. I wouldn't even begin to know how to translate those, but it does not seem like a long shot, because at least 50% of the art found in the caves was art that was pretty inaccessible. In Rouffignac, you have to go about 3/4 of a mile into the cave before you get the first art. In things like the shaft in Lascaux, you have to crawl. In fact, these places had to be excavated so that we could get in. You had to crawl. They were inaccessible. They did not take people in there. And so what Jean-Claude and Louis Williams surmised was that this is where the shaman would go to have their visions, and that what you saw on the walls were recordings of their visions. And this, again, is the same theory now applied to the art of the Upper Paleolithic. Again, very, very similar structures to the art of the San people. And depictions of the visions they had, the invocation of the power of the spirits. The feeling of going into these places, not completely subjective, as most of this was, but the feeling of going to these places is going into the temple of the earth. These are sacred places. And many, many people have that experience of almost like traveling. This is the entrance to what's called the axial gallery. This moving almost through a passage like the vagina of the earth itself into these mysterious places. There's evidence of drumming that went on, of musical instruments, that these were places where you probably had an interesting combination of vision and sound. Oftentimes, as you go through the caves, this is Peshmerel, which is a little bit further south of here. There will be demonstrations of the guide will flicker a light, and the animals literally seem to come alive, like in the early motion pictures. And then the spots, the blowing of paint over the hand, you find across a huge range of rock painting from a variety of different locations and a variety of different times. So that in the end, much of this was probably very closely related to something that was very highly selected for, which was the entrance of religion, very powerful religion, very cohesive religion, into the lives of our early ancestors. Now, I want to end on a different note, slightly different note. Like most forms of human behavior that we're selected for, we very quickly transcended those forms of behavior. Me grunting, "Goat over there, let's go kill," transforms itself into the elegant poetics of Shakespeare. Okay? A life, language, a life of its own. And so too is, I think, in art. Art very quickly, and I think here in the caves, moves beyond whatever evolutionary origin or significance it had. Because I think what the shaman discovered, as many of us have discovered, is that language itself is limited. Conceptual language is limited. Talk is limited. And that the attempts to move beyond that oftentimes lead us into doing music, lead us into doing dance, lead us into doing art. And that what we're able to do in the arts is slowly approximate expressing that which cannot be expressed. And almost all people who do some form of art will talk about that, about trying to move their inner world into an outer world, not only for others to see, but for them to see. Many artists paint for themselves with no idea of ever letting other people see their paintings. They're very private. Why? Because the art is a way of seeing, for you to see what is inside yourself. And that attempt to try to express without betraying what's happening inside, I think, is fundamentally the gift of art that far moves us beyond its biology and its evolutionary history. So as I return back to the caves finally, still don't know what those damn bulls mean, okay? But what I do have a sense of now on this journey is why I respond so powerfully to them, why tears came to my eyes, why it was a moving experience. Because I have now a little bit of a sense of the journey that it took us as human beings and why, if you like, I'm rigged to respond to that. Okay, I think I'll quit there. I'm going to have to look at the screen. I can't see it very well. And you see this, and you say, what is that? And the Martian says, what is that? And you say as an earthling, well, that's a musician. And well, what's he doing? Well, he's singing. Well, what's that? Well, that's a religious ceremony. Oh, what are they doing? I think they're proving that God's on their side. Oh, by the way, I'll try to talk a little bit about art, but if you haven't seen the Picasso in the City, highly recommended, and also the Stein collection, highly recommended. What's that? Oh, well, that's a piece of art worth millions and millions of dollars by Pablo Picasso. Well, why is it so valuable, and what's it doing? So, what I'm going to try to begin to deal with, and I don't have the hubris to even think I'm going to come close, but I'm fascinated, and have been for years and years and years, in the question of why. Why music? Why religion? Why art? Okay? Because of all the human universals, they seem to have little or no survival value. I mean, sex does, language does, all the crazy stuff that we do in the body, you can explain easily, but you can't explain easily music, religion, and art. Darwin was absolutely perplexed by this, particularly music, and suggested maybe, well, it could have something to do with sexual selection or keeping couples interested in each other. But I think it's for at least evolutionary psychologists and biologists, it's been a real interesting set of discussions. So I'm going to explore that a little bit. I'm going to start with music, but and I think that's probably as far as I can get, and then I'll kind of tell you where I would have gone with that. So music, religion, and art go deep, deep into human evolutionary history. That if you go back as far as we have artifact anyway, you'll find evidence of all three. And what I'm going to argue is they were selected for because they helped early humans survive by increasing social solidarity. I'm a sociologist, what else will I say? Meaning emotional connection. But we now understand and know some of the mechanisms of how that can work. In other words, we are pre-wired for religion, music, and art, just like for sex and language. And I think in the end that begins to have very profound implications when you start denying those parts of self. Think about what would happen if you denied your sexuality. You could do it, okay? But think about what's lost in the greater human experience. And I would argue the same for all three of these, including religion, by the way. That can be an interesting discussion. And then finally, this is where I really apologize to my anthropology colleagues. I'm going to argue that they co-evolved and that they had basically mutually reinforced each other. And we can talk about that. Okay, I'm going to start out with something that triggered my own thinking about this years ago with Jane Goodall. And in her book, Reason for Hope, she describes her spiritual awakening, her epiphany. And she's sitting in Paris, and this is in the kind of middle to late 70s. She's sitting in Paris in Notre Dame Cathedral, and she's looking up at the beautiful rose window, the beautiful stained glass. And in the background, they are playing, let me see if I can, here we go, playing box to cut it. And at that moment, she has her epiphany that we're all fast. Sorry. That was a great ringtone, a much better ringtone. And so, anyway, here's her description of what occurred, sitting there looking at the beautiful rose window and listening to Bach's The Cottage. Anthropologist, you recognize him?
Yeah, but I can't think of his name.
I'll give you a hint. He wrote Catching Fire.
But I can't think of
Harvard rang him.
Yeah.
Okay.
People came, you married and had a son, many students were there.
Including you.
Including me. You published a lot, and this became the chimpanzee study. And in your book, you describe how it was not until many years later, in 1974, that something very special happened, which was that you were in France, in Notre Dame Cathedral, and you had a return of some of the great spiritual feelings that you'd had earlier in your life. What had happened in the intervening time? Had you forgotten them, or what was the change going on here in your life?
Well, I think the times alone in the forest, you know, I very much had the sense of this great spiritual power. It was there, it was all around. It was actually present in the forest and in the beings that lived in the forest, as well as being present in me. So I wasn't actually debating about it. I wasn't consciously thinking it through, but it was there. So that when I looked back, I realized what had been going on. So that when I went into Notre Dame, it was after a difficult period of my life. The divorce was happening, and it was just so amazing to walk into that wonderful cathedral where I'd always wanted to go. And the sun was just shining through that beautiful rose window. Have you been there?
No.
You have to now, don't you? And just like, as though it was being orchestrated by some divine power, the great organ sprang into life. Just as I walked in and looked up at that window, it was a wedding, which was way off in some corner, and it was playing Bach's Toccata and Fugue in G minor, and it was just so beautiful. And it just hit me all of a sudden, you know, how can this be chance? The whole amazing cathedral, the beautiful music, the mind that made it, the sort of feeling of, you know, what you get in an ancient cathedral, that so many people have prayed there and had their thoughts and their feelings and their fears and their joys there. That was all around. And my mind that could suddenly, in an instant, comprehend the whole sort of span of evolution and question, why are we here, and is there a purpose, and is there a reason, and is this moment something that's meant to be important for me? And so this really brought everything back into its old original place in my mind.
And fused your philosophy and your chimps.
Yes.
And that's good, because you were entering into a difficult phase. The years from then.
Okay, so what you see is this wonderful juxtaposition of art, both as architecture in the rose window, music, and that triggering then some very, very powerful experiences that she identifies as religious. And probably many of you have had similar experiences I have, and I could resonate with that very well. But it really got me thinking, well, what is this relationship between how art works, how music works, and how religious experience works? And so that's kind of the background. And, oops.
Before 1977, you had a number of difficult things to deal with.
Okay, so what I'm interested for our purposes this morning is recognizing, and I think Jürgen talked about this earlier, that we as humans exist in a biological, psychological, social, and spiritual world. And there's a temptation oftentimes to approach looking at a phenomena like this from simply one perspective. Or, for example, if you're going to do what I'm going to do this morning, speak from the biological world, to try to reduce everything to that. And nothing could be further from the truth and further from any kind of productivity. But because we're embodied creatures, I think starting from the body is a good place. But if that's all you do, I think that there are real problems. And I think Leslie will maybe talk about similar kinds of things going on without having to invoke the body. But that's where at least I want to start my exploration. I'm going to use a perspective, what's called evolutionary psychology, kind of in vogue, takes what's called an adaptionist perspective, that everything is, everything isn't, Jürgen, help! There, okay. First, that all human behaviors result of adaptations to the environment. That these adaptations follow Darwinian principles, either of natural selection, sexual selection, or recently group or kin selection. That in the case of evolution, the mind developed into specific modules, modularity of mind that were selected for. Thus leading to what is oftentimes called the Swiss Army knife conception of mind. You have all these little modules connected by neural networks, that the brain is a kludge of these things. When you look at religion, music, and art, though, the principles of natural selection don't seem to work very well because these things don't seem to have any particular selective value. And the focus in traditional natural selection was the individual itself. And so, including Darwin, came up with the idea of sexual selection. Well, not everything is necessarily purely adapted for survival, but there's also selection that goes on between mating pairs, so-called sexual selection. But still, there was what was called a fitness criteria. That is to say, how do you explain the peacock's beautiful tail? What was to attract the peahen so she would get all excited. But what was underneath that was a display of fitness, that this guy, number one, had enough good nutrition and good body to be able to support such a thing, and secondly, was a wily character who, dragging around all that shit, could escape the predators. So it still got back to survival values. One of my favorite biologists, who's now dead, Stephen Jay Gould, argued, wait a minute, you know, not everything is adaptive, come on. And he used the example of the spandrels, what he called the spandrels, which is when you take a structure like arches, you're going to produce structures that go along with it called spandrels, these connection pieces in between, that are not the intention, are not the purpose. But if you're going to have arches, you've got to have spandrels. But what's important is the arches, not the spandrels. And again, if you go and read the biology, there's a wonderful set of debates coming out of that. But that led Steven Pinker, following in Gould's steps, to argue that particularly the arts, particularly art and music, were what Pinker called cheesecake for the mind. I saw an interview with him a year ago. He's still arguing this crap, okay? I thought I should just he's still arguing this, okay? And more specifically for music, he said it's auditory cheesecake. The idea of cheesecake, by the way, is no accident. We evolved to have a preference for sweets and fats. Why? Because we didn't come across them very often. And so when we did come across them, we'd load up on them. But now all you have to do is walk through Safeway, and you can have them every day. And of course, a lot of us have said, is he implying that art and music are evolutionarily dangerous? Well, religion we can have an interesting talk about, but those, I don't know. So cheesecake is simply, again, an evolutionary byproduct. In the last 15 years or so, however, a very interesting paradigm has developed increased credibility. And that's the idea of first as kin selection and now talked about as group selection. Particularly when you try to explain things like cooperation. The old paradigms simply don't work. And I think now probably most evolutionary biologists accept some version of this. And that then allows us to start looking at the adaptive value of art and religion and music from a very different perspective. Because now, I think at a biological level, we can argue that what they did was that they were selected for because they dramatically increased social solidarity, which has huge survival value for our early ancestors. See all the fun debates we can have nowadays. And of course, that echoes sentiments that Emile Durkheim, one of the modern fathers of sociology, developed more than a century ago about the primary role of social solidarity, and particularly in religion in the creation of social solidarity. So what I want to do to kind of look at this is turn to music, because music seems to be the least obvious, maybe, for this kind of paradigm. First, that music is ancient and goes back way, way earlier than any of us ever expected. How many of you saw, what was that, the Cave of Forgotten Dreams? Yeah. If you haven't seen that, it's a wonderful thing to see. Make sure you see it 3D. And they actually play this flute that was found in southern Germany. But it's when you listen to it, it's surprisingly modern in terms of its sound.
Worldwide. Fløyten ca. 35 000 år gammel. Og en kopi spiller slik.
Okay. It was found with some Venus figures, and again, the date goes back somewhere between 35 to 40,000 years ago, which corresponds to the earliest cave paintings we have so far, Chauvet Cave, okay, and of course the Venus figures. So it feels like there's this soup emerging that has graphic arts and has music together. And then one interpretation of all of this, of course, is that the caves were sites for shamanic ceremony, meaning religion. Now, it takes a lot of pieces to actually demonstrate that, but I'm pretty convinced that you can make a good argument in that direction. If you've been to the caves, this is Perchemel in the south of France, they do feel like cathedrals. And in fact, many people have argued that in part they've been selected for their acoustic value. And in fact, again, from my anthropological friends, there's a whole new field that has emerged called archaeoacoustics. And it's a real hoot to read some of this stuff. You know, like a lot of prehistory, there's a lot of speculation. But folks are really trying to grind this out. So I would argue that music is very, very ancient. Okay, now the problem with talking about music is its complexity. Many people have argued that it may be one of the most complex forms of human behavior, given all its components. Okay, what I'm interested in talking about is rhythm, reverberation, its relationship to movement and emotion, because I think these are the major components in the creation of solidarity. This is a mapping of the human brain, and if you look at the brain in terms of the production of music and also in the listening of music, you see that it carries, it covers most of the functional areas in the brain. You get even a better sense of that. Again, if we had had time, I would have gone through each of these with you. But it pretty much covers everything people do, from our memories to our system of expectations to our emotions to the cerebellum and our movement. It just is all in one place. One of the things that was fascinating for me, and this is starting to address a piece of the emotional component, is the whole experience of the chills. I would, not everybody experiences this, but I think probably a lot of us do. You listen to a particular piece of music and you have tingling going up and down your spine, or you get goosebumps, but you feel it physically. And there was this great study done, Levitin, I forgot his first name. Anyway, Dan Levitin, who had people select music that gave them the goosebumps, gave them the chills. And then they put them in, an fMRI machine and watched what happened. And what happened was that the pleasure centers in the brain, which are some of the most archaic old centers, just lit up. And so, and about the only thing that tends to light up those pleasure centers are, psychologists, sex, drugs, not all drugs, but particularly highly addictive drugs, chocolate, but it's a very narrow range of things that stimulate the pleasure centers. Oh, music turns out to be one of them. So now I've got a big piece. Music can feel so good that it can feel like, some of you who haven't experienced this going, this is bullshit. Feels like sex, okay? Feels like drugs, all right? And this will have implications later on. So I think that was one of the major discoveries, that it's unbelievable power. It's also linked up to areas like the amygdala in the brain, centers that are highly involved in emotion. The other, though, this Mr. Williams, this dates me, is that the role that it plays in synchronization. That is to say, one of the things that music can do is it can create attunement between us. Not only in ourselves, when we listen particularly to rhythmic music, do our brainwaves start to synchronize, but when we listen to it with others, our brainwaves can synchronize with their brainwaves. And a lot of this is based on the discovery of mirror neurons, which was first discovered in monkeys quite accidentally, that the same areas in the brain were activated when the monkey grasped something. In this case, it wasn't a banana's popsicle, grasp a popsicle, and then watching someone else grasp a popsicle, in this case a human being. The exact same areas in the brain were stimulated. So it's been suggested then that because of the physical response to music, that mirror neurons are heavily involved in our ability to listen to the same thing and literally respond to it in a very clear and empathetic way. And there's a whole bunch of research now that's being done in that area. Now I want to give you some examples. That's one thing to talk about it. I'm going to give you a number of examples of solidarity, connection, emotion, produced by music. And we can also turn this into a quiz. Do you recognize the film this is from? Oh, brother. So there's a long history of work songs. Everything from rowing on slave ships a la Charlton Heston to chain gangs, where solidarity was created with rhythm. Now, getting political. Solidarity created for political ideology.
Africa.
Recognize the film?
Cabaret.
Cabaret. Watch your own internal responses as you're watching this, and watch how the structure of the music changes and the emotion it produces.
Tomorrow belongs to me. The branch of the linden is leafy and green. The Rhine gives its gold to the sea. But somewhere a glory awaits unseen. Tomorrow belongs to me. The babe in his cradle is closing his eyes. The blossom embraces the bee. But soon says the vesper, arise, arise. Tomorrow belongs to me.
I had to include that. Taiko drumming. If you want to see the not delicacy, but the fineness of attunement that can happen. Feel what's happening in your body, and I'm watching my body just literally, physically respond to the rhythm. Okay, and then finally, a little bit of the Sufi dance, the Moldevi order of Sufis. I think this was filmed in Turkey. solidarity. But then one of the absolutely magic parts of music is its ability to transform consciousness. Not only at the mundane level, okay, your mood, but at some of the deepest levels of human experience. And that becomes now the movement into religion. So let me just do a couple more points and then I'll stop. So clearly when you look at religious experience, having altered state, having mystical experience is one aspect. Faith, belief, religious ideas, and ritual and community. And historically for sociologists, it's this latter that was the point, again articulated in Durkheim. And the argument goes that music, again, now becomes an unbelievably great device for doing that, for creating social solidarity. But it also has a second property. And one of the questions maybe at the end we can talk about, is there a selective value for altered states of consciousness? I have no idea, okay, but it's something I think about. Can that also be selected for, given that it's universal in some degree or another? Huh?
98% of society.
Yeah, 98% of society. So again, is it a spandrel or is it selected for? Usually, if something's universal, I'd make a strong argument. It's probably selected for, some aspect of it is selected for. So let me tell you what I was going to do this. So I take a quick look at religion and again the role that music plays in religious and the production of religious experience. I then go through the material on the, is there a really fast way to do this? Yeah. I then go through,
It's a really fast way.
yeah, that's what I was thinking. I then go through John Claude and David Lewis Williams' argument about shamanism, and that in fact what not all but a lot of the cave art was about were about shamanic experiences and recording them, and again there's lots of interesting evidence for that. And then that leads us to finally looking at art. Looking at art, oops, as a way of expressing these ineffable experiences, and that particularly, I think, with early art, it was heavily engaged. If you look at the iconography, if you look at the figurines, and God knows all the stuff that we've lost, and most of it probably just perishable, painting of the body, shells, and we can go on and on, that it was deeply ingrained in the ritual structure of the culture and in the religious structure of the culture.
And that's what I'll talk about a
And
little bit more
exactly.
in a minute.
Okay.
Thank you. No, that'd be a great.
So, since you've just been doing a lot of listening, get out a piece of paper, or use your iPad, or if you don't have a piece of paper, get one from your neighbor. We have paper.
Oh, no, that's my paper.
Are we returning the paper to you, or?
No, it's just for you. Oh no, leave the light off if you
Give you
can.
my iPad.
Okay, get out a pen, if you have more than one pen, get out all your pens. And we're just going to shift gears here for 5 minutes. Okay. So, you're being observed. I want you to draw. This is not for writing. I want you to draw. Okay. So here's what we'll do is I give you the basic instructions, and we're just making this a brief exercise. This could be much longer. I want you to draw.
Are involved in every aspect of it.
Okay, for me, this is all part of a very personal journey that I've been trying to deal with for, I think, all my adult life. And so I just want to share with you 3 experiences, and then as, again, the evening unfolds, I'll keep putting them back into a context. When I was a younger fellow, I studied Zen with a wonderful Zen teacher, Maezumi Roshi, down at Zen Center, Los Angeles. And as part of that training in the particular kind of Zen that he practiced, you would get a koan. And a koan is, I don't even quite know how to describe them. They're kind of funny stories. And so as a beginner, we were all given the koan mu. And it's a very simple one. It's a monk comes up to the great Zen master Joshu and asks Joshu, Joshu, does dog have Buddha nature? And Joshu looks at him and then lets out this big, whoa! And that's the koan. So in your first year or so of training, they put all the new students together in a room, and during these prolonged meditation retreats called sesshin, you sit and you all moo together. There's a part of it that's just wonderfully ludicrous. Moo, moo, in the whole room, mooing, and then, as the sesshin moves on, mooing late into the night, and so on and so forth. And then you go and you have what's called dokusan, which is a face-to-face meeting with the teacher, where you display your understanding. And initially, I think for most of us, the understanding is pretty, Buddha nature, everything's got Buddha nature. Yeah, dogs got Buddha nature. And, Roshi would look at you, not good enough, go away, and on and on. But then, after about 4 or 5 days, we were talking about this, with these meditation retreats, there's a period of days, and about 4 or 5 days, you're just worn down and you're tired. And, there's all this mooing and not sleeping. And so finally, I had dokusan and went in, and I just yelled. All I could yell. Just, I can't even do it anymore. I lost my voice. It was horrible. But in that moment, something remarkable happened. I felt the universe pass through me. I still had my own consciousness, but I felt this unbelievable connection. And for a moment and I have no idea how long it was, I sat there. And, now retrospectively, I was feeling bliss and all those other wonderful things and totally connected and all that. And then I finally snapped to, and I look at Maezumi, and he's a funny guy anyway, and he kind of looks at me and says, "So Scott, now what are you going to do?" And I spent the next 40 years trying to figure that out. The second experience I want to share with you took place in Paris a few years ago, and I think it's probably a fairly common kind of experience that people have. This is at Saint-Étienne-du-Mont, which is a Catholic... Pardon? Oh, it's a Catholic cathedral. And I went with some friends on Easter Sunday to an Easter Mass. And it's gorgeous inside, and the light is streaming through the beautiful stained glass windows. And there was an organ, and they were playing, I don't know exactly, I think it was Poulin or something like that, but this gorgeous music. And I felt this literally unbearable experience. It started out as goosebumps and then moved to tearing up. And then it was the point where I felt like I was going to explode. I literally, physically couldn't stand it anymore. And it was beyond elation. It was something that was almost physically painful. Thank God it stopped, and I went on. And then the last experience, again, there's an irony because I'm a Buddhist and these both took place in Catholic churches, and I was scratching my head about that for a long time. I shared this one with Jürgen a while ago. This is the crypt of St. Francis in Assisi. And again, I was with Kathleen, and it's a very powerful place, and so we went in, and I think you started crying. She started crying immediately because they have the word peace in all the languages of people. And you walk in and you go, ah! So we went down to the crypt and sat there quietly. And I forget, we sat a long time. I mean, a very, very long time. Enough time so that there was no sense of time passing. And I had this unbelievable sense of presence. And I don't know who it was or what it was. You know, because I'm not a Christian, it could have been St. Francis. Jürgen said, you know, St. Francis was a pretty powerful shaman. And, you know, they used to build those churches over pagan sites. So who knows? You know, I had no idea. But this, again, an unbelievably powerful kind of experience. Now, though the experiences are transient, a very huge residue was left with me. And a few years ago, I had to undergo treatment for cancer. And what got me through that, interestingly enough, was going all the way back to the Dokusan with Maizumi, where I realized, because they thought I was going to die, I wasn't afraid. At least I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid, but I was afraid of surgery, chemo, doctors. I was terrified of that, but I wasn't afraid of dying. So it's interesting that there's a residue. So all this stuff we're going to be talking about tonight is very, very, very personal for me. Okay, very quickly then. I think that when you look at any human phenomena, and I'll now try to speed this up quite a bit. You look at any human phenomena, you have to recognize that we as humans live in 4 worlds, and these 4 worlds interact and operate simultaneously. We have a biological world that has an evolutionary history. So some exploration of mystical states has to include the biology, has to include the brain. We live in a psychological world. We have unique psychological histories. In some ways, though we are very much alike, we are also totally and completely unique. And it's understanding those unique psychological histories, for lack of a better term, our personalities, that is also very important. We live in a social world. We live in historical time and space. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that, you know, how we live in the 21st century is different than how people lived in the 19th century. And the beliefs, the ideas, as Eric was talking about, you have to look at all of this stuff in a cultural context. And that cultural context is constantly moving and shifting, developing. And then finally, we live in a spiritual world, for lack of a better term. Each of us has the potential connection for an unseen world. For some of us, it's God. Who knows? I mean, I won't even go there to try to define it. As we talk tonight, for all of us, I think you have to recognize that it's not just one of those worlds. And whenever you analyze something like mysticism through just the lens of one of those worlds, it is simply not sufficient. It is simply not sufficient. It's all of these worlds interacting together that you have to do. And that is unbelievably complex and difficult. And so the journey that we're going to go on is not a simple journey. Okay? So the interaction then of all these different worlds. Finally, my thesis is, as humans, we're pre-wired for mystical experience. It comes out of our evolutionary history. Towards the end of this evening, I'll show you all the interesting brain mechanisms. There's a whole new discipline called neurotheology that looks at the interaction between mystical experiences and what's going on in the brain. And that's why you find mystical experiences in all human cultures. But I think, as both Jürgen and Eric pointed out, like other universals, there's tremendous individual differences. We have different capacities, though I think it's stuff that can be learned. And it's dramatically affected, shaped by. Start out from somebody having a mystical experience and becoming a charismatic leader, and then that slowly gets translated, legitimated, and bureaucratized, becomes dogma, and is gone. So we'll look at that process, but it's important to recognize that even in the desert religion traditions, okay, Jesus went to the desert. Moses had his burning bush, and the prophet Muhammad all had what are classically defined mystical experiences. In the Asian tradition, and I'll kind of go through this quickly, because in some sense this is not a class in comparative religion, even though we could turn it into that pretty quickly. in the Asian traditions, particularly in Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism, there's a tremendous emphasis on having direct experience, on having what we'll end up calling mystical experiences. And in some way, that's how they differ from contemporary Western religions, because the whole idea of the practice is, in fact, to have the experience. Okay, I'll go through this pretty quickly. Alan Watts once joked, and when I was a kid, I used to go hear Alan Watts when he was in Sausalito, once joked that Buddhism was Hinduism for export. And all my Buddhist friends really get pissed off at that. But when I talk about Hinduism, you'll see immediately that Buddhism has a huge amount in common with it. And of course, you'll also see that Buddhism has a lot in common with Taoism, because Buddhism went from India to China. The Buddhists and the Taoists said, oh my goodness, let's be friends with each other. So it's no surprise or no accident that even though there's tremendous differences between each of these theological systems, you're going to see a certain amount of commonality. That's because they did not evolve in isolation of each other. Okay? So in the basic formulation of Hinduism, the whole idea is that there's a merger between Atman and Brahman. I am Atma Brahman, Atman, self, and self now, and we'll talk about it when we talk about Jungian psychology, self, not the little self. That will mostly be ego that we'll use that word. Self, the larger self that's connected, merges with, becomes Brahman being itself. The term yoga means union. And so the whole foundations of Hinduism and Hindu philosophy are for each of us as individuals to eventually have union, eventually merge, eventually connect with the larger world of the spirit, which of course is central to mystical experience. I won't go into depth on each of these. The Hindus have perhaps developed one of the most sophisticated forms of this exploration, with all the different forms that yoga takes, from the control of the breath to control of the mind to control of action to control of love to the control of energy itself and the Kundalini. This is an example of the Kundalini system, which is about moving energies through the chakras, all again with the intention of, at some point, developing some form of enlightenment. What's fascinating here in the West, and this is just a commentary, is that we've taken these spiritual technologies and we've turned them into not only ways of making money, but we've turned them into practical technologies for well-being. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's somewhat ironic that hatha yoga now is what you do for health, not to meet God. That Kundalini becomes more about developing esoteric powers that you can use to make friends and influence people. And so again, one of the things that becomes interesting is to look at how American culture transforms these systems. One of the interesting things about, again, Indian culture is that they have institutionalized the quest. If you are a high caste, if you're a Brahmin, the expectation is when you get to be actually 20 years younger than me, when you get to be in your 40s, early 50s, you say goodbye. You become a sannyasi. You leave the family, you leave the business, and you go on the quest. And so literally, when you travel around India, you see all these guys, commonly called sadhus, who are wandering around doing all kinds of interesting things. Sometimes they don't have clothes on, sometimes they do. Sometimes they're smoking dope, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're doing yoga. Next slide. Sometimes they're not, but they're, they live close to the bone, they hang out with each other, and they're looking for God. Buddhism, and again, without getting into too much detail about this, Buddhism emerged out of the cultural foundations of Hinduism. And again, the terms in Buddhism are very close to what you find in Hinduism. And again, I'm giving you a horrible, gross stereotype. But the whole idea is to obtain nirvana, which is to break the cycle of reincarnation, of birth, death and rebirth. That's done through having experiences of enlightenment, satori. And satori is obtained by prolonged periods of samadhi, deep meditation understanding. And this is all set out in the Buddhist framework by the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. In Buddhism, there are some divisions, although one of the most interesting things about Buddhism as a world religion, it's remarkable how much consistency there is in basic beliefs. Whether you practice Tibetan Buddhism, or whether you practice Zen Buddhism, or whether you practice some form of Theravadan Buddhism, the fundamental beliefs and practices are virtually identical. Mahayana Buddhism, sometimes called the Great Vehicle, is practiced in Japan, in China. Vajrayana, this is Theravadan Buddhism, is sometimes called Hinayana, but that's a pejorative term meaning lesser vehicle, is practiced in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, in the southern part of Asia, and then Vajrayana is Tibetan Buddhism, although again Vajrayana you can find in Japan, called Shingon, but it's the practice that's mostly associated with Tibet. Taoism is the third, and it's the one probably least accessible to us here in the West, and at least least understood. Let me recommend 3 books that deal with Taoism. Most of us, know about the Tao Te Ching, which is one of the most read books in all of human history. It's up there with the Bible. There's like 50 English translations available and all that. Very few people know that Taoism is a formal religion. You can go to San Francisco, go to a Taoist temple, have rituals performed, and that it is a whole set of practices. So let me just very quickly read you a description of the nature of Taoist practice. And for those of you who know a little bit about Buddhism or Hinduism, this is going to sound really, really, really familiar. Blind to perfection, men live darkly. Lost to all knowledge of the Tao, they pursue unworthy goals. Piling up gold upon gold, jade upon jade, they contend for wealth, rank, power, and fame. Opening the gates of the 6 senses, they steep themselves in extravagant luxury and foolish ostentation. Yet some there are who know how to value the teaching without words. This is now referring to the Tao itself. To value the teaching without words. To cultivate the art of leaving well alone. Eschewing the high pinnacles of fame, the manacles of wealth, they take their case and wander through the lonely vales, far from the haunts of men, and sit enwrapped in contemplation of the interplay of the shining vapors. Free from passion and inordinate desire, in stillness they absorb the cloud-like cosmic essences, blend them with the secret treasures of the body, and attain the light within. Attuned to nature's rhythms, they perceive the Tao. Rightly, they are called immortals, for when time is ripe, they leap on the backs of dragons, and rising from the earth, enter but do not loiter at the gates of heaven, that they swiftly obtain the source. Thus they return, winging ecstatically to the lofty, lucent ocean. Themselves now limitless, eternal, they plunge into the void. And again, that could be Hindu, that could be Buddhist. That was the slide we wanted. Those are the Taoist immortals. Okay. So out of all this, then a question comes. We see throughout human history, throughout a huge range of human cultures, people reporting mystical experiences. So one of the questions that's come up, and it's come up for a long time, is there a universal set of mystical experiences? Is, in fact, as I'll try to talk about later, at a biological level, are we pre-wired for this stuff? And that's why you find it in all these different guises in human history. Aldous Huxley, probably in the 20th century, first proposed this as what he called the perennial philosophy, That is, when you scratch not the orthodox religions, but when you scratch their mystical sources, that's sometimes called the esoteric religions, you find that they have much more in common than they have in terms of difference. Okay? The first, not first, but probably the major Western thinker to really try to define what mystical experience is was William James in his book, The Variety of Religious Experience. Highly recommend that you take a look at this book. It is as relevant today as it was in the early 20th century. Basically, and throughout the rest of the presentations, what I want you to do is watch for these different qualities that mystical experiences have. James said that they were ineffable, which meant you couldn't find the words for them. Okay, they're not available to the rational mind as a description. And when you try to describe your experiences, you sound really silly. Okay. Second is they're noetic, meaning you have some sense of gaining special knowledge, that there's some new understanding that comes out of these experiences. Third, that they're transient, meaning they don't last. Okay. And then fourth, James thought that they were passive, meaning they came and went and there was nothing that you could do to make them happen. That one probably all three of us would disagree with. The other major thinker, and for me I think one of my favorites is Walter Stace, who wrote a book called Mysticism and Philosophy. Okay, and what Stace did was develop this fascinating system where he said, look, there's really two major kinds of mystical experience. One that transcends time and space. And the feeling there that you get is you lose yourself. You lose time, you lose space, you're gone. Okay? And the other, he called extrovertive, is that you keep your consciousness, but you have this tremendous sense of awareness and connection. The experience that I described to you that I had in the Zen situation was the extrovertive. Meaning consciousness was there, but this experience of oneness, of interconnection with everything. And then the last fellow is that I want to talk about is Walter Pahnke. He was a professor at Harvard, did a lot of the original LSD studies with Tim Leary. And Pahnke did a study where he gave like psilocybin to divinity students, and they all had these great epiphanies on and on. These are the qualities that he attributes to mysticism, and these we're going to see over and over again. First is a sense of unity, so a sense of connection. Secondly is you have the sense that you are experiencing a special truth. Third is that you transcend time and space. Fourth is a sense of sacredness. That was the experience I had in Assisi. I didn't know what, but it felt sacred. That you feel very, very positive. That in fact the euphoria, the joy can be overwhelming. That was the experience that I had in Paris. There's a paradoxicality, which is this stuff doesn't make sense logically. Seeing Geist, seeing spirits, what do you do with that? Ineffability, you can't talk about it. The transient nature, the fact that it passes. And then finally, in the end, for an awful lot
words in beautiful writing give them that experience.
Could you go back to the, yeah. In many of the Islamic forms of mysticism, particularly in Sufism, the geometric forms and the calligraphy become the objects of meditation,
right.
Just as Eric was describing the iconography
right.
For the Eastern. Okay, I'm supposed to talk a little bit about meditation. Let me just say three things really, really quickly. Using the word meditation is like using the word love. What does that mean? It's a huge, huge range of things that we could talk about. Some of which have to do with the production of mystical experience, a lot which don't. And probably the only thing I want to say at this point is that when you actually look at the traditional Buddhist and Hindu forms of meditation, what they're about, for all practical purposes, is the ability to go deeper and deeper, trying to get to the essential self on one side and to cut off the outside world on the other. But those are just kind of two forms of meditation that you find among hundreds. In the Tibetan tradition, you find, I couldn't even list the number of different kinds of meditation, just as in the Theravadan tradition.
Yeah, what you see here is really, the arousing ones, the active ones, and the tranquil ones, and I think both are, separate ways.
So, and prayer, another, a pathway to experience is prayer, which usually Christians, actually, and Christians, Jews, people in the Western traditions, experience prayer all kinds of different ways, right? Usually what is meant by prayer is something that is specific and organized, and often prayer takes place in a holy place. And so there are holy places. I have some shots here of monumental holy places, and there's a sign. I'm sorry, could you go back just one? This is the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall, the Kotel. And it's what's left of the remnants of the Jewish temple, that part of the structure that was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. And there's a sign, there are many signs that kind of guide you in the experience of the Western Wall. And this is a pilgrimage. This is the principal holy site for Jews, right, in all over the world. And they come to pray and to experience something. And there's a plaque, which I didn't take a picture of, over there on the left side, which says that essentially it quotes a passage from Ezekiel, where Ezekiel talks about an ideal temple that will be built, and where the presence of God, the Shekhinah, is the Hebrew word. Shekhinah in the Bible refers to God's physical manifestation as a presence. And it will come and reside in the temple, and this is the spot, right? So the idea, the theory, is that Jews are coming here to the wall, to the place where you meet God, to the place where you meet God's visible presence, and ideally you might feel something, you might have that experience, right? And so here's it is again, very fuzzy, Russian Orthodox Jews. This is July, and it's 106 degrees. And they're wearing black and big fur hats, look like marshmallows. And this is Elijah's cave, another holy place. This is a sign on the wall. Here's a warning. This sign is at the entrance when you go into the one ramp where non-Muslims can go into the Temple Mount area. It's a sign that's directed at Jews, saying to them essentially, you really shouldn't go here. We don't want you to go in there. And this is the reason, because according to Torah law, really this sign is relatively new. The main reason really is because Jews and Muslims mixing in each other's holy places has had a tendency to incite violence. So the next slide. Another thing that I encountered, I didn't really plan on in Israel, is the Baha'i Gardens. This is in Haifa. And the Baha'i is a world religion. It's one of the most widespread of all world religions. It's relatively recent. It's only a couple hundred years old. And it began in Iran. It's kind of a sort of an offshoot of Islam. It's most closely related to Islam. And the Baha'i have two holy places, and they are, both of them, they're the burial sites of the two main figures of the founding of the religion, and both of them are the most magnificent gardens that exist in the world, anywhere. They're, in all the books, and all the Guinness Book of World Records. This dominates the entire hill from the top of the hill in Haifa, the Carmel Ridge, all the way down to the beach. And it's just acres and acres and acres of gorgeous gardens. And it's the obligation of every Baha'i to contribute money for the upkeep of this garden. And no Baha'i are allowed to live in either city. The only two sacred cities are Haifa and Akko, which is just about 10 miles up the coast. And no Baha'i are allowed to live in those cities, but they come there. It's their main destination to go to a pilgrimage. And they come and pray, and there's inside this temple, There is no, visitors can go in, but the only condition is you have to leave your shoes outside and you must not make a sound. And the idea is that it's an environment. It's a deliberate environment. It is for the purpose of prayer and meditation and for the purpose of facilitating an experience. And that's another ceiling.
Yeah. Okay, the experience of nature. And I'm just going to say something cryptically that will make sense a little bit later. One of the things that being in nature allows us to do is basically shut off the left brain and activate the right brain, given all the stuff that Jürgen was talking about. What happened? Next one.
Dreams are next.
Okay, your dreams.
So, in dreams, we also at times, have mystical experiences, extraordinary things. Let me just maybe give you...
Does that help? Huh?
Why didn't we do this?
I don't know. I'm not responsible.
I had a dream, for example, in which I was killed, and I went through the bardos, and I had this mystical experience of going through different states of consciousness in that dream. That's a mystical experience in a dream. So dreams can, Jung would call these big dreams, dreams that, are important for your life and that teach you something.
Okay, one of the other aspects of the kinds of things that routinely can produce a mystical experience, we've talked about things like fasting, and all of us, I think all three of us have had experiences with that, though it's been a long time for me. But ascetic practices, the Buddha went through a period of denying the body, and a large number of the Hindu traditions engage in ascetic practices. Back to this one. There's also some evidence, and this is a wonderful book I'd recommend to everybody called Holy Anorexia, that a fair number of the early Christian saints also practiced forms of ascetic experience and perhaps were even anorexic. The body is a very common tool that's used, and again, in things like Hatha Yoga, where the body is used to create the experience. And also mortification of the body. In much of India, these are very, very common practices. And then sexual practices, the Tantra. The Tantra is both symbolic, meaning it's about the union of opposites, the union of the masculine and the feminine, but it's also a practice. In Taoist, the Taoist tradition, and also in the Tantric Indian tradition, you practice things like how long you can sustain intercourse. And, I'm very curious to see the effect that Viagra has had on the Tantra, because there's stories of the Taoist masters being able to sustain erections for days and days and days. I don't know if these are apocryphal stories or not. Learning to suck up your semen so that you ejaculate and then you suck the semen back. Now you sound, no one can do that. I actually saw a sadhu take his penis and suck water back up. I mean, these are things that in the West, you say, how many years did it take you to learn to do that one? What? But it's all part of a very, very powerful tradition of relating mind and body, and then using mind and body as the vehicle for transcendence. And again, that's something that's hard for us to understand here. And again, this is the Yabyum. Now, one of the questions, so we've seen all these different practices. What do they have in common? Why is it that, and again, this is a gross oversimplification, but why is it that fasting on one side, penetrating your body with needles on the other, prayer on the other, dreaming on the other, produces very similar states. Well, there's a wonderful, I don't know, was anthropologist, Winckelmann, an anthropologist, who has suggested that what all these states have in common is what they produce. And what they produce is exactly what Jürgen was talking about earlier. They produce a synchronization of brain function and an integration of brain function. And it's shown up in things like the EEGs, the electroencephalograms, producing theta waves that are highly slowed but synchronized brain waves, and the production of serotonin, very particular serotonin pathways. And so Winckelmann believes that there's a reason that we do all these practices in terms of coming to some fairly common end experiences. So serotonin, for those of you who don't know, that's a neurotransmitter, and then these are what theta waves look like. Kind of our normal, everyday just being alert is beta, alpha relaxed, and then theta is this state that's very commonly associated with deep meditation and mystical states.
Okay. Maybe just very quickly, people have speculated, is there any similarity in the personalities who have these mystical experiences? One hypothesis, well, they're fantasy-prone individuals who seem to be particularly hypnotizable, who, if you go look a little bit further down, they frequently report clairvoyant experiences, telepathy, precognition, automatic writing, out-of-body experiences. Now, the interesting thing about them is there's no psychopathology there. They're well-adjusted, they cope with their everyday life just like everybody else. One of the questionnaires to try to investigate mystical experiences, to what extent do people either believe in mystical experiences, believe in miracles, etc., etc.? Now, what they found with the help of these questionnaires is they seem to cluster in families. And twin studies show that about 37 to 50% of the variation in spirituality seems to be explained by genes, which means that 50 to 63% are not explained by genes. So there is a genetic component in terms of the gift that is a part of this. We could look at other personality traits, which I've listed there, but I won't go through these or discuss them at this moment.
Okay, Carl Jung, and you're going to, again, this is almost the trouble with this topic is that any one of the things we brought up this evening, we could spend the entire evening on. And it's kind of interesting to see what it's like to steamroll through this. But Carl Jung has developed a certain kind of resurgence with the, next slide, Jürgen, with the publication of the Red Book. And Jürgen and I have worked together looking at the Red Book. And basically, what I think much of the history of psychology has ignored is that what Jung was really most fundamentally interested in was union, was connection, was basically getting the ego and the self to interact in such a way that you could have spiritual experiences. Now, the Red Book turns out to be the diary, the log of his journey in a very brief part of his life, trying to basically meet this deeper world.
And what he's doing is in many ways is shamanic. He has or it could have happened in the desert in Israel. He has these profound conversations with these spirits, these other beings, and it is like an everyday conversation. So I'm just going to read you a very brief example. He introduces it by saying, "Am I dreaming or am I awake? It's hot. The sun already stands high. How the hours pass. Truly, the morning is nearly over, and how astonishing it has been. Is it the sun, or is it these living stones, or is it the desert that makes my head buzz? I go up the valley, and before long I reach the hut of the anchorite. The anchorite is somebody who has secluded himself from society to kind of a monk. He is sitting on his mat, lost in deep reflection. I say, "My father, I am here. How have you spent your morning? I was surprised when you said yesterday, the time passes quickly for you. I don't question you anymore, and this will no longer surprise me. I've learned a lot, but only enough to make you an even greater riddle than you were before. Why all the things that you must experience in the desert, you wonderful man? Even the stones are bound to speak to you." "I'm happy," says the anchorite, "that you have learned to understand something of the life of an anchorite." And it goes on from there, and you can see, these are very lively dialogues, and like they have their own reality, these other beings. They're there, they're present for him, and he engages with them, just like we would over a latte in a coffee house.
Yeah. He has a spirit guide. This is Philemon, who was his spirit guide in the beginning of the explorations. Why the Red Book was just recently published is the family held on to it because they had the belief that if people read this stuff, they'd think that Jung was totally nuts, that he was totally crazy, that he was working so outside the cultural box. Now, one of the things that he talks about is what happens when the self confronts the hidden world, the spirit world, the larger world. And one of the things he says is that you get a really interesting response because it is so powerful. It is so overwhelming that oftentimes the ego, which is our everyday personalities, the ego becomes dramatically inflated. And so one of the things that you begin to see when you look at spiritual teachers, when you look at historically the charismatic leaders, they all have these massive, massive egos. And Jung, for me, gives the first explanation of that because it's so intense when you encounter this other world that the ego can become dramatically inflated. And we'll see that a little bit when we talk about the origin of religion.
A lot of native traditions actually counter that with humor.
Yeah.
And teasing you.
Yeah, I just, picking up, I love the Native American tradition of humor. Generally speaking, in the desert religions, you don't find a lot of that. Seriously, there are a couple of different kind of parallel themes. I'm staring into blue. I'm having a mystical experience right now. The blue light.
The blue light experience.
The blue light reminds me of. No, never mind. There are two themes, two really different trends in the literature and the discourse in Western desert religions. And one stream is that the mystics in the traditions are revered. They are, as I've already said, in the desert traditions, there are dramatic, mystical encounters with the other world, encounters with God, that lie at the foundation of each of the traditions, right? Essentially, the founding stories for Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Mormonism, all of them rely on basic narratives that are the foundation stories, with the encounters, direct encounters with God, Abraham, Moses, Paul, Muhammad, Joseph Smith, and so on. A lot of these, my observation, and I'm speaking now as a biblical scholar, not as a psychologist. I had college courses in psychology, but I haven't done a lot of systematic or disciplined study of personality. But one of the things that I've always observed about to the extent that personality shines through in these traditions, I've sometimes, even when I was within and a passionate member and believer within one of these communities, I found that in looking at the personality that shines through, most of them, they're not someone I would hang out with. You're not someone I would pursue as a friend. And I just pick up and extend a little bit Scott's observation about ego. And frankly, I'm not sure. To me, it's an open question. I wonder which precedes which. Paul, if you read Paul's letters, he has this dramatic experience narrated and sort of at the foundation of, and a lot of people who are Christians refer back to this experience as sort of the proof positive. It's second to Jesus' resurrection of the doctrines, the dogmata, as we mentioned that tonight was not about. But Paul's letters are loaded with ego, loaded with fighting, with putting down his rivals, with insulting and degrading those who teach a different doctrine than he does. He uses violent language. He uses scatological language. And he seems to me to be, in his letters, sometimes simply a megalomaniac. Muhammad looks the same way. Joseph Smith looks the same way. And so a lot of these, as the writings developed, if there's enough of a history where you have development over a couple of decades, which you do in the case of all the ones that I've mentioned, you see a development where there's an initial mystical experience which sort of justifies then in the future everything else that they might do. And at the end of their careers, all of them tended to be power-grabbing, megalomaniacal kinds of personalities. And so I don't know what to make of it. I don't think that there's an essential connection between mystical experiences and that kind of personality, because you also have people that are mystics and that we have a lot of information about that are the opposite, that they're completely outside the mainstream and they critique and depart from the normal paradigm, the master narrative, right? But many of them, I guess it kind of depends on which way they tend, depends on whether they're inside or outside the basic structures of orthodoxy. For example, I'm thinking of just one more. I'm thinking of the Sufis, for example, and I have a collection of Sufi writings. And one of the things that is interesting about Sufis, the Sufi tradition is something that developed in Islam fairly early on, and the Sufis were inspired by the mystical nature of Muhammad's founding experiences and so on. And so Sufis within Islamic tradition developed a mystical style of being Muslim, but they also developed similarly to Tantra, right? Yeah. They just like Tantra has a right hand and a left hand, the Sufis had a sober and a drunk, right? And so Sufis often were spoken of and spoke of themselves as either a drunk Sufi or a sober Sufi. There's two different styles. And the sober Sufis were the ones that were a little bit more sedate, a little bit more well-behaved and suitable for a G-rated setting, right? Whereas drunken Sufis were after the same thing. And they both understood, sober Sufis and drunk Sufis, both understood each other to be after the same thing, which was, they would describe as union with God, as a throwing off of all the trappings of form and self and a union with God. But they went about it different ways, and the drunk Sufis were entirely outside of the mainstream of the Orthodox structures, and one of the results of that was that many of them were killed. They were stoned to death by angry mobs in the streets of Baghdad and other places because they were so out there. Well, one famous Sufi, for example, went around the streets, according to the stories about him, he just took off his clothes one day in the middle of Baghdad and went around saying, "I am Allah." Right? I'm Allah. And they killed him. Go figure, right? And so you have these different ways that mystics play in terms of the structures of the established structures of the Orthodox religion.
I think we should push forward and then just
Yeah.
open up to discussion. I think let's not do this and let's just go to, I think, there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to show you a little bit about how mystical experience and cultural values play together. And are most of you familiar with Janie Goodall? Let me see hands. Famous primatologist. And in the 1970s, she had a profound religious experience, okay? She was in Notre Dame Cathedral, and as she describes it, light came in through the rose window, and they were playing a Bach. Will that go off? They were playing Bach's Toccata and Fugue, and the whole world opened up. Well, let's take a look at her describing this.
People came, you married and had a son, many students were there.
Including you.
Including me. You published
This
lot.
is
and,
Richard
this
Wrangham,
became
by the way,
the
anthropologist at
chimpanzee
Harvard,
study.
who's got a book
And in
out
your
now
book,
called
you
Catching
describe how,
Fire. I don't know if you've heard of it.
It was not until many years later, in 1974, that something very special happened, which was that you were in France, in Notre Dame Cathedral, and you had a return of some of the great spiritual feelings that you'd had earlier in your life. What had happened in the intervening time? Had you forgotten them, or what was the change going on here in your life?
Well, I think the times alone in the forest, I very much had the sense of this great spiritual power. It was there, it was all around. It was actually present in the forest and in the beings that lived in the forest, as well as being present in me. So I wasn't actually debating about it. I wasn't consciously thinking it through, but it was there. So that when I looked back, I realized what had been going on. So that when I went into Notre Dame, it was after a difficult period of my life. The divorce was happening, and it was just so amazing to walk into that wonderful cathedral where I'd always wanted to go. And the sun was just shining through that beautiful rose window. Have you been there?
No.
You have to now, don't you? And just like, as though it was being orchestrated by some divine power, the great organ sprang into life. Just as I walked in and looked up at that window, it was a wedding, which was way off in some corner, and it was playing Bach's Toccata and Fugue in G minor, and it was just so beautiful. And it just hit me all of a sudden, how can this be chance? The whole amazing cathedral, the beautiful music, the mind that made it, the sort of feeling of, what you get in an ancient cathedral, that so many people have prayed there and had their thoughts and their feelings and their fears and their joys there. That was all around. And my mind that could suddenly, in an instant, comprehend the whole sort of span of evolution and question, why are we here, and is there a purpose, and is there a reason, and is this moment something that's meant to be important for me? And so this really brought everything back into its old original place.
Okay, so what you see there is profound experience, huh? Music, light, context, cathedral, and then her personal and cultural narrative put together with that. Now, the argument I would make, just really quickly, is that spiritual experiences are fairly common. I think what the psychologist Maslow talked about with peak experiences, some of you have experienced it listening to music, you've experienced it in nature. You don't necessarily attribute it to being religious, okay? In fact, it may just go in passing and unnoticed. But imagine those experiences becoming more and more and more intense, and what that becomes like. And then imagine that you've got a narrative that fits that experience, as she did. She grew up in a religious family.
Okay, just very quickly, just some catchword here. We have touched upon it. We'll touch upon it again. When we are, focused on rationality and dismiss these experiences because they're difficult to research, they're difficult to validate, to verify. When we inflate them and inflate our ego about it, that's all something that is discouraging or inhibiting mystical experiences. When they are privileged and only certain people can have them, who are up in the hierarchy, or when we are pathologizing, and we'll deal with pathology and madness in a minute.
Should we just go through this? I mean,
Yes.
just skip it.
Yeah,
over it?
sure.
I'm just really worried about time.
Yeah.
Okay. Neurotheology. Now, because of time and constraints, oh, shit. I should really, yeah. I'm just going to go through this really, really quickly, and then later if you guys want to come back to it. Basically, in the last 20 years, there's been the advent of a whole bunch of tools for studying the brain while the brain is, you can go through this while I'm talking, while the brain is in process. One is using very sophisticated electroencephalographs. We talked a little bit about that, about mystical experiences producing theta waves. The other is the use of things like PET scans. And what they do is they inject you with a radioactive form of glucose, and then the parts of the brain that are active absorb that glucose at a much faster rate than the parts of the brain that are not active. And so they've developed all kinds of ways of studying what's happening in the brain while things are going on. All right? Now, one of the claims, and I think Jürgen set the stage for this perfectly, is that mystical experiences are nothing more than either malfunctionings of the brain or epiphenomena of certain forms of brain activity. And as Jürgen mentioned earlier, central to understanding the brain is the fact that we have two cerebral hemispheres, okay, connected by this huge bundle of nerves called the corpus callosum. And that's what allows the brain to act in an integrated fashion. Now, what you see very basically is that the right hemisphere that controls the left side of the body is the brain that is associated with religious experience. And the left hemisphere controlling the right side of the body is the brain that is associated with discursive logic, thought, and all of that. Now, when you actually go through a list of the words that describe right hemispheric function, what you see is that those are the same words that describe mystical experiences. Okay, next one. So, there was this gal, hopefully some of you know about her, Jill Botte Taylor. She became one of Oprah's cause celebs, and she had a massive stroke, and that stroke gave her a religious epiphany. Now, where'd she have the stroke? She had the stroke in her left cerebral hemisphere. So all those language functions, those dominant functions that Jürgen was talking about earlier, were shut down. Here's her description of that experience.
My headache was just getting worse.
Yeah,
so I
she's
get
a
off the machine,
neuropsychologist.
and I'm walking across my living room floor, and I realize that everything inside of my body has slowed way down. And every step is very rigid and very deliberate. There's no fluidity to my pace, and there's this constriction in my area of perception, so I'm just focused on internal systems. And I'm standing in my bathroom getting ready to step into the shower, and I could actually hear the dialogue inside of my body. I heard a little voice saying, okay, you muscles, you got to contract, and you muscles, you relax. And then I lost my balance, and I'm propped up against the wall. And I looked down at my arm, and I realized that I can no longer define the boundaries of my body. I can't define where I begin and where I end, because the atoms and the molecules of my arm blended with the atoms and molecules of the wall. And all I could detect was this energy And I'm asking myself, what is wrong with me? What is going on? And in that moment, my brain chatter, my left hemisphere brain chatter, went totally silent. Just like someone took a remote control and pushed the mute button. Total silence. And at first I was shocked to find myself inside of a silent mind. But then I was immediately captivated by the magnificence of the energy around me.
Doesn't that
And because I
sound
could
familiar?
no longer identify the boundaries of my body, I felt enormous and expansive. I felt at one with all the energy that was, and it was beautiful there. And then all of a sudden, my left hemisphere comes back online, and it says to me, hey, we got a problem, we got a problem, we got to get some help. And I'm going, oh, I got a problem, I got a problem. So it's like, okay, I got a problem. But then I immediately drifted right back out into the consciousness. And I affectionately refer to this space as La La Land.
Okay, you're good.
But it was beautiful there.
That's probably enough. So what you begin to see then is maybe what these experiences are is the shutting down of the left hemisphere. Okay, because when you do that, then you get the kind of experiences she's describing. Now, another version of the story of neurotheology is the temporal lobe, both left and right. And V.S. Ramachandran, who's at UCSD, did a study of people with temporal lobe epilepsy. And about 30% of the people who have temporal lobe epilepsy experience God, experience the presence, experience mystical revelation. And so Ramachandran wrote up his stuff, and the press got hold of it, and they started talking about the God spot. And Ramachandran will be the first to tell you it's not one spot, but that this process, for not everyone, but about 30% of the people who have temporal lobe epilepsy, produce the same kind of experiences that you find in mystical revelation. He then did something really interesting. GSRs are like lie detector tests, galvanic skin response. He took a whole bunch of highly religious people, and he took his patients that had temporal lobe epilepsy that were having these religious experiences, and he showed them words. And what he found was the temporal lobe people responded to religious words the same way that you and I respond to words around sex. Meaning they went off the charts with the GSR, where you and I would go off the charts with sexual words. They went off the charts with religious words. And again, what he discovered was that there was this profound sensitivity that these people had to things related to religion. By the way, the normal religious believers, they responded just like you and I. Almost no GSR response to God, and a lot of GSR response to sex. Second guy that's done a lot of work with the temporal lobes, and this in some ways is the most interesting guy, is a guy named Michael Persinger, who's up in Canada. And what Persinger did was he used basically magnetic stimulation of the brain over the temporal lobes, and was able in about 80% of his subjects to produce some kind of religious response. Mostly the sense of a presence, okay, like I experienced in Assisi, right? But something that was vaguely religious. He then went on to develop a helmet that, basically influenced the magnetic structures, and then started studying people's responses as he developed different magnetic frequencies. And again, the temporal lobe was central in that. So this is now where the neurosciences are kind of honing in. One of the most interesting stories is, this is Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins, for those of you that follow the kind of scientific side of the critiques of religion, is probably one of the big three. He's right up there. And his book, The God Delusion, is just a savage attack on religion. So Dawkins says, I got to see what all these people are talking about. So he volunteers, goes to Persinger's lab, okay? Nothing happens. Nothing. I mean, nothing, right? Heard interviews with Dawkins. He's really disappointed. He said, I want to experience it. I want to experience it, right? Nothing happens. Persinger says, I'm not surprised. it turns out that there's differential susceptibility to temporal lobe phenomena, with the most susceptible people being the epileptics up on one side and people like Dawkins down at the bottom. And so it starts to get into this question, are we differentially wired to have these experiences? And the answer is probably yes. Okay, next. And then, next slide. The guy who's probably the leading researcher now in neurotheology is this guy, Andrew Newberg, and he's got a bunch of books. The most recent one that just came out a couple of weeks ago, Principles of Neurotheology. And Newberg uses the most sophisticated, next slide, most sophisticated techniques. And what he's discovered is, you know, when I think about the ways that mystical experience has been described, we go all the way back to Stace, who described basically the kind of introverted and extroverted ways, that is, the experiences of the loss of self and the experiences of connection and the experiences of present. Temporal lobe stuff produces experiences of presence and connection. Parietal lobe, which is up here, very close to where your motor strip is, produces sensations about loss of self, loss of body. So this is what Newberg is interested in exploring. Next slide. The temporal lobe is also very closely connected to the emotional centers. In fact, the amygdala sits inside the inner portion of the temporal lobe. So you would expect that activities that are going in the temporal lobe are going to have profound emotional consequences. And so Newberg then has done a whole bunch of studies of prayer and meditation. And basically, next slide, what he's discovered is that, and this is what you would expect, just as we know there are different kinds of meditation that are experienced differently, he's found brain signatures that correspond to these. So all of a sudden it helps us start to play with, well, if it's just subjective experience, and when I say I'm feeling bliss and you're feeling bliss, how do we know we're talking about the same things? Well, it gets a little closer if you find out that what? You're stimulating the same parts of the brain. So, for example, this is a SPECT scan is again, it's using radioisotopes, basically. And what he discovered was that in Tibetan monks, that there's an increase in the attention area, because much of Buddhist meditation is focused on what? On dramatically increasing your attention. Next slide. But that what falls away is your orientation, meaning your awareness of body and what's going on around you. Now, this will vary because there are certain forms of Zazen where that area actually dramatically increases. So what we're starting to find now is that we're developing a whole vocabulary to be able to talk about the different forms of meditation and what's going on in the brain. Now, the next one I think Eric's going to like, all right? He looked at prayer, and he looked at Franciscan nuns at prayer, and like you would expect, there was an increase in the language areas, all right, compared to baseline, because they're concentrating on their prayers. Next slide. But that the orientation area, which is here, I can get my little pointer, right, dramatically declined. So what you've got now are people concentrating on their prayers, but again, like in meditation, the orientation part is disappearing. Okay, next slide. Now, the other one that's interesting, worship here, I finally read the article, what this refers to is he took people, Pentecostals, who spoke in tongues, and he said, okay, I want to see what you look like when you're not speaking in tongues. So just kind of do like, singing some songs and dancing around, but not in tongues, all right? And so what he got was that, and this only makes sense when you compare it to the next slide, what he got was that when they started speaking in tongues, okay, Jürgen, next slide, there is a dramatic decline